All right, we'll continue our discussion of respiratory physiology and talking about how oxygen and carbon dioxide are diffused into the blood from the alveoli and then move between the tissues. So again, talking about the diffusion of these gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse a little differently, essentially based on pressures of those gases, concentrations, again, of those gases, and also their solubility coefficient. And we find that carbon dioxide is 20 times more soluble, which means it will dissolve into the blood and diffuse more readily than oxygen at lower pressure gradients. So carbon dioxide is very efficient at diffusing from tissues to blood, even though there's less of a pressure gradient for carbon dioxide between the blood and the tissues than we see with oxygen, comparing oxygen pressure differences from the blood to the tissues. So looking at oxygen, it's always favored to diffuse from the alveoli into the blood because the highest concentration of oxygen is going to be in the outside air. And then we bring that in to our lungs during inspiration, and that high concentration of oxygen is going to diffuse from the alveoli to the blood. And remember that oxygen will bind with hemoglobin in the red blood cells. So if it's completely saturated, it means that those red blood cells, the hemoglobin within those red blood cells, are completely filled with oxygen. Think of it like a school bus. It's completely filled with oxygen molecules as it leaves the lungs. And then we find that oxygen will eventually become dilute as we feed the tissues, and in the veins, when we pick up carbon dioxide at the end of the tissues on the venule side, that concentration of oxygen goes down. So we will look at oxygen and compare it to carbon dioxide. Looking on the right side here, we see the carbon dioxide always moves from the tissues into the blood, because the tissues are the metabolizing cells that are using the oxygen and using that to metabolize, for example, taking glucose in the presence of oxygen and releasing CO2 and water. So they're constantly supplying carbon dioxide into the interstitial fluid, which then diffuses into the blood from the tissues. So the highest amount of carbon dioxide is always going to be in the tissues, and the highest amount of oxygen is always going to be in the alveoli. So we have a diagram here that shows the circulation from the heart between the lungs to the body tissues. And we can see the partial pressures of oxygen at different points along the circuit. So I'm going to start here in the alveoli. When we inhale air into the lungs, the pressure of the inspired air of oxygen, we call this a partial pressure because air is a mixture of different gases, but the two gases we're concerned about are oxygen and carbon dioxide. So we see it's the highest out here in the inhaled air, and then as it's inhaled into the alveoli, that oxygen pressure concentration goes down a bit because it's diluted with water vapor in the airways, which decreases the pressure a little bit. So we have the partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli at 104 compared to 160 out in the inspired air. So if we compare that to the pulmonary capillaries coming into the alveoli, there's going to be less oxygen because it's coming from the body. It's been diffused to the tissues, so that's the lowest point of oxygen concentration, is when it's going to the pulmonary capillary from the veins, from the pulmonary artery, because remember the pulmonary artery goes away from the heart leading to the lungs. So that's where we see our lowest oxygen concentration, is from the pulmonary artery leading to the capillaries. And then we see that carbon dioxide is diffusing from the blood into the lungs, because that is, again, carrying blood that is returning from the tissues and released all that carbon dioxide as a result of metabolism. So that's going to diffuse from the pulmonary capillary to the alveoli to be exhaled. So we see this diffusion here again from higher concentration to lesser concentration for oxygen, going from alveoli to blood, and for carbon dioxide going from the blood to the alveoli. And then as we cross this capillary bed in the lungs, we'll see that picking up of oxygen is occurring across the capillary until they're equal. And we know that once concentration gradients are equal on either side of a membrane, there's no more diffusion. The same thing occurs with carbon dioxide. We see a loss of carbon dioxide across the capillary bed until those two pressures become equal, and then we do not see any more diffusion. So the most rapid diffusion is occurring here on the pulmonary capillary, on the pulmonary artery side of this capillary bed, and then that stops when we leave at the pulmonary vein side of the capillary bed. And so then that we can see continues and goes to the heart. Now we lost a little bit of oxygen here. We started at 104 in the capillary and we dropped down to 95, and that's because the lung tissue itself needs oxygen. The lungs are made up of cells that require oxygen to do their job, so we see a loss of oxygen as a result of just keeping the lung tissue alive. Notice carbon dioxide levels have not changed. So then that passes through the heart and then passes out again, because that goes, remember, to the left atrium, to the left ventricle, out through the aorta to feed the tissues. So these tissues could be any tissue cells in the body, the brain, muscle, stomach, whatever tissues we're focusing on. And we'll see that there's always going to be a lower amount of oxygen in the interstitial fluid because the tissues are constantly pulling that oxygen into the cells as it's metabolizing. So we see a diffusion from the blood into the tissues here, and the lowest point in the body in this diagram for oxygen concentration will be in the tissue cells. That drives diffusion from the blood to the interstitial fluid to the tissues. And then those tissue cells are actively metabolizing, so they're producing carbon dioxide. So we're always going to see the highest amount of carbon dioxide inside the tissues, and then to the interstitial fluid, and then into the blood. And then as that crosses through the capillary bed, again, all these pressures become equal, diffusion stops, and that blood is returned to the heart and returned to the alveoli to start the process again. So it's very important to recognize as we move across the capillary bed, we have rapid diffusion here at the point where the alveoli and pulmonary capillary come together, and as that blood continues to pass through the capillaries, we see pressures becoming equal. We see a slight drop in PO2 as we go to the heart from the lungs, because again, the lungs use up a little bit of oxygen. And as we go from the blood to the tissue cells, again, we're going to see this net gain of carbon dioxide, net loss of oxygen, and again becoming equal at the end of the capillary bed and returning to the heart. So I have a brief animation here that describes some of these processes. Oops, thought I did anyway. Got a little error here. I will find it.
Fresh air entering the lungs carries oxygen to the alveoli. The amount of gas in air or of gas dissolved in a fluid can be expressed as partial pressure, which is measured in millimeters of mercury. The partial pressure of oxygen in the air within the alveoli is 104 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide that enters the alveoli from the blood causes the carbon dioxide concentration in the air of the alveoli to be 40 millimeters of mercury. Carbon dioxide is continually removed from the alveoli as air is expired. Blood coming from the heart at the arterial ends of the pulmonary capillaries has a partial pressure of oxygen, or PO2, of 40 and a PCO2 of 45. Therefore, oxygen diffuses from the air in the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide diffuses from the blood into the alveoli because of these differences in partial pressures. Oxygen and carbon dioxide diffuse until there is no difference in partial pressure in the air and the blood. At this point, there is no more net movement of O2 or CO2. Therefore, at the venous ends of the pulmonary capillaries, the PO2 in the blood and alveoli is 104, and the PCO2 in the blood and alveoli is 40. Some oxygen was removed from the blood to nourish lung tissue. Therefore, the PO2 in arterial blood leaving the heart is 95. Oxygen diffuses out of the arterial ends of tissue capillaries into the tissue fluid, then into the cells, and carbon dioxide diffuses out of the cells into the tissue fluid, then into the blood because of differences in partial pressures. At the venous ends of tissue capillaries, the PO2 in the blood is equal to the PO2 in the tissue fluid, and the PCO2 in the blood is equal to the PCO2 in the tissue fluid, resulting in no more net movement of O2 or CO2. The blood now carries the O2 and CO2 to the lungs. In the body, all of these exchanges occur simultaneously.
Okay, so moving back then, how oxygen is transported in the blood, two different ways. Most of the oxygen in our blood is bound to hemoglobin. Remember, that's the protein found in red blood cells that can bind 4 oxygen per hemoglobin molecule. And the rest of oxygen is dissolved in the plasma. So it's not inside the red blood cell, but floating freely in the plasma. So it's important to understand how oxygen is transported, because we have these hemoglobin molecules. When we're not actively breathing, if there's a short period of time where there is disruption of respiration, there is still time for those hemoglobin molecules to unload oxygen to the tissues. Carbon dioxide, on the other hand, is transported a little differently. Most of it is transported as bicarbonate ions, which we'll talk about where those are located, and some is bound to hemoglobin. Remember, we have the globin portion of the hemoglobin molecule, so 23% of carbon dioxide is bound to hemoglobin, and the remaining 7%, just like we saw with oxygen, is dissolved in the plasma. A lot more in the plasma compared to oxygen. So we'll pick up in our next discussion more description of how carbon dioxide is transported in the blood.